Hello. Lesson 14 in that course of lectures entitled Thought as Word Dynamics. And maybe before I delve in the new lecture, a little recap of why is my approach which is quite proper to me, to artificial intelligence, why can I summarize it under that title of Thought as Word Dynamics? Because what was new in the approach I developed in the late 80s was my reliance on words as encapsulating a lot of what we need to do when we're trying to make appear, emerge from what a machine does, something that sounds intelligent and maybe represent to the listener something like the presence of a sentient being there in the machine just by the combination of words. And that was what was probably new in the approach I developed. In the book I published in 1989, which is not recent at all, and of which I have a copy here in my hand, in the 2012 reprint called Principe des systèmes intelligents. In the very introductory pages, I was saying something of the type about the power of words, and that thought may just essentially be our summoning of the power of the words which are there in the lexicon before we're even born. There's that extraordinary tool at our disposal, which is language. If I were born in the family of orangutan, I could have done quite a lot of things in the world, but I couldn't have used a language which was there ready-made in order for me to use it. And maybe it's worth that I read a couple of two paragraphs from the book, very introductory pages 14 and 15. So book published, as I just said, published in 1989. We've been, no doubt, fascinated by the fact that self-organization can emerge from the organization of a neural network made out of artificial neurons. 1989, this is 5 years after the renewal of the connectionist approach by McClelland and Rumelhart, the two big volumes about the trying to pass the obstacle which had been set there by Minsky and Papert when they undermined the idea that the neural networks were the way to go in order to mimic a type of intelligence. Why do I hesitate? Because I'm struck by the fact that Minsky is highly regarded, and but in my days, the days I was doing as a researcher in artificial intelligence, he was very much vilified for having been the person who was with Seymour Papert. Marvin Minsky had undermined entirely the approach developed by McCulloch and Pitts, Weizenbaum, on trying to develop the neural networks as the way to do artificial intelligence. But words are nothing else, each one of them playing a particular role which is incomparable, of coming with something ready-made which is called which is called its meaning. And when combining these words, one obtains new meanings And these new meanings are not so much the addition of the meaning of the individual words, that kind of multiplication of their effects. We think of words as tools which are there at our disposal and that we can use or not, and then make things with them. We forget the following, which is that they were there when we were born. We didn't have to devise them, that which is the case with most tools. But they're extremely powerful in allowing us to do a lot of things that we don't have to reinvent. If I were orangutan and I want to use language, I would have to invent it because it doesn't exist. But as a human being, I'm just born and I can just use these words which are there lying all around. And my power, of course, to change their meaning is minimal. But at the same time, boy, I'm so powerful because I can use them and produce any sentence I wish with little effort. And now, the more we know about the amazing way the large language models work, we understand it's not difficult at all. We don't have to learn to use a language. Just by combining the words, things come automatically. And then, of course, there are statistical patterns which can be grasped by a pre-trained system, but that all comes by itself. I hesitated a little bit because I think of an anecdote, which is not a pleasant one. In my days as a student and then, young researcher, the works of Noam Chomsky were extremely present, and we were told, including by colleagues, that was the way to go. If you disagreed with Chomsky, you were nowhere. You would have no understanding of linguistics. But I did. I never believed a word of. I read. I still have copies of these very early. Light blue covered books by Chomsky when they were published in a kind of very technical series, and I read that with a lot of attention, and I didn't believe that that's the way it works. And why am I sad? Because I think of a good friend I had at the time, and a fellow anthropologist, and he was very much a follower of Chomsky. And one day he said to me, when we were discussing these issues, will you repeat what you just said? And I said, well, why not? Yeah. He said, because if you repeat it, then from now on you are my intellectual enemy. And I thought he was kidding, right? I mean, I couldn't see. And I said, of course, and I won't say his first name. I said, of course, I'll repeat. And I repeated what I said, but he meant it. And I haven't spoken to him since then. And it's been, if he listens to this or if he sees it sometime, he needs to know that that's an important source of sadness, that attitude, especially in retrospect when I know that he was entirely wrong and I was entirely right. These large language models show us that there's nothing we can do out of what Chomsky produced. I know it was painstaking that he put a lot of effort in it, but this is just for nothing. And it's particularly sad that now he's a kind of sour loser, and that he tries to poo-poo what's been done by saying, well, that because it's not like what I said, then therefore it's not the right approach. No, Mr. Chomsky is the right approach, and it's you who were wrong. Sorry, that happens. That people devote their whole life to a particular approach and maybe even become famous because of that, and that turns out that was not that important. Anyway, chapter 11. The endogenous principle is primal. I remind you of the following, which I've developed in the early lectures. I was thinking about your organization, that the natural network we have of neurons we have in our brain, how it likely to be organized. And through deductions, reflections, and I said, well, you know, there's psychologists have thought about that, but also philosophers have thought about that. How could that possibly be organized? And I rely a lot on two things. I rely a lot on what Aristotle said about linguistics, which he didn't distinguish at the time from what he was saying about logic or philosophy or whatever. In that collection of books of his called the Organon, and in particular in the one called the Categories, there's a lot of the Topica, also the Analytica and so on. In the booklet called the Categories, he distinguishes 10 what he calls categories, and these categories are ways to associate two words into a word pair. And as I showed, one of the 10 categories saying of something what is its substance, what is it made out, as opposed to saying it's blue, it's hard, it's here in Rome, or it's here in Paris. Apart from that, there's one which is a substance, and the other ones operate very much like coatings that come on that substance. And having said that, I've been using, for our benefit, I've been combining ways of looking at things in linguistics, coming from ancient Greek philosophy, plus all the developments that were made up to the 16th century, essentially 15th century, within medieval linguistics and logic, in particular what is called the theory of the supposition, and which my lecturer that I much admired, Roman Jacobson, the linguist, said that actually, in his view, linguistics had stopped in the 15th century developing, and then from then on had been regressing. So I went back to the sources he had delineated for our benefit, and I've been combining that with the way that the Chinese philosophers of about the same period, the 5th century BC, were also thinking about language, words, the way we combine, and the paradoxes that may erupt. And when you think about combining for our benefit the way that the ancient Greeks approach issues and the Chinese, you can think that that notion of substance in Aristotle corresponds to that of impenetrable in that of Chinese. The Chinese opposing penetrable and impenetrable. And when I say the rose is red, I've got an impenetrable, which is the rose, and I have a penetrable, which is the color, pink. Thorny is also penetrable. You can, on one particular substance, on one particular impenetrable, you can put as many coatings as you wish of penetrables that are then stacked on top of it. And having said that, having tried to explain that, I've reached a point where I say that the way that the units which are in our brain, which are word pairs, and that comes from Aristotle, they are organized in two different ways. One very much is about these coatings. Rose is red, it's thorny, it's fair, it is it will be tomorrow in the same place, etc., etc. This is I called the endogenous relationship between these content words. And when we talk about the hierarchies, taxonomies, the way they are included into each other through ways of inclusions, that I called the hereditary principle. Why hereditary? Because properties which are attached to a notion higher up are inherited by the notions underneath. Now, in ancient Chinese philosophy or even language, there was very little of these hereditary principles organization. And as far as we're concerned, in the Western philosophy, Western approach, it's only recently, too, that we've been developing these very large, very broad, or very high up hierarchies which connect things through the hereditary principle, and which allows from properties to be inherited from one level to the next down in terms of universality, that all the, if I say animals have this property, vertebrates will have that property, mammals too, etc. And in the other way, from top up, properties are inherited, but only partially. If I say felines are mammals, I can only say some animals are feline. I can't say all of them are. All felines are animals, but only some animals are felines. And that's where we stand in my my little talk. We noted in passing that deep hierarchies are a recent phenomenon when mentioning that Aquinas' classification of angels was one of the few inventions in recent times. That must have been in the 13th century, unless I'm wrong, and maybe in the 14th. Aquinas came up with this notion that because we can't imagine that we talk right away to God, that, well, we may have tried, but that doesn't work, and that God speaks directly to us, we would have heard it. There's a set of 8 categories, I think, not categories with the meaning of Aristotle, but 8 types of angels that constitute a kind of ladder between God and ourselves. God can speak to very high up angels that will still understand that what he says, but not everything. The further category, the further type of angel down will understand a number of things that the category above do, but something will have been lost until we get to the archangels, which can speak to us like Gabriel spoke to Mary. And then we have the final category, which is the guardian angels that, as we know, are part of the divine nature, but they speak to us every day, or even every minute of the day, at least for some of us. So that classification of angels and in 8 levels of complexity is a relatively recent notion, being from the 13th or 14th century, and the work of Aquinas, Saint Thomas. We're familiar nowadays with the multi-layered hierarchies that the natural sciences have generated over the past 4 centuries in the realms of biology, chemistry, and physics. The process we've mentioned of the trickling down of essential properties from label to exemplar is no secret to us anymore, since the likes of Linnaeus captured the natural world in a set of Galois lattices, which is a particular type of mathematical algebraic structure. But what about the thinking process in the period that preceded this creation of high multi-level hierarchies? Emotion and relevance were the default chunking strategies, and that's essentially what Chinese archaic thought has been doing, and that that the anthropologists discovered and called the problem of totemism. What was called totemism was very much the remnants of Chinese archaic way of thinking found in different people, all people around the Pacific Ocean, from Asia going up to the Bering Straits to Alaska, down the whole continent of of Americas, which we know now was peopled by a number of people, the Siberians on top, but very much a variety of people from China and different islands which were populated by China and themselves and so on, down to the whole of America. So, emotion and relevance are the default chunking strategies. The simplest formal chunking strategy is that of the contrast set, and the simplest contrast set is that of binary opposition, which needs only a superordinate label. An example of that is yes or no. Larger contrast sets may also be accommodated under a single label. Primary color terms, for instance, black, white, red, blue, green, yellow, orange, brown, purple. Terms may be, but not need to be, exclusive. For assent, yes, no, maybe are not exclusive in terms of the middle term. When the number of elements in the contrast set grows large, the chunking strategy is to group items on the basis of a superordinate similarity, often the term in the form of a taxonomy. The taxonomy, however, presupposes co-exclusivity among pairs of elements at the same level. E.g., mammals are never reptiles, mammals are never birds, fish are never birds. The most general kinds of chunking are the overlapping hierarchical relations. Definition itself is the most primitive or fundamental act of chunking. Definition is usually accomplished by replacing a series of implicit or extended labels and unmarked category by a label for their intersection, a new word. I had the opportunity to analyze the working of what amazed 20th century anthropologists in what were called in the 1920s examples of primitive thought, and resurfaced in the 1980s under the name of the rationality debate. In a classical example of so-called primitive mentality, the Nuers of southern Sudan claim that twins are birds, as was reported by the anthropologist Evans-Pritchard. And the claim twins are birds was accompanied by the concurrent claim that birds are twins, which is reported on the same page in Evans-Pritchard's book, Newer Religion. This controversial opinion amounted simply to establishing between two different stuffs a symmetrical relationship, typical of what I call the endogenous fields. The anomaly results from the fact that our modern mind cannot help but hearing here instead an anti-symmetrical, inclusive relationship such as found in hereditary fields. Our tendency is to interpret twins are birds as meaning twins are a subcategory of birds alongside other birds, which is, to our modern mind, blatantly false. We don't believe that twins are a subcategory of birds in one way or other. We're in no doubt that twins are a subcategory of human beings, belong to the order of mammals. At the vertebrate realm level, birds and mammals represent mutually exclusive orders where no species belongs to both. Therefore, if anything, like twins, has been recognized as a mammal, it can't also be a bird. Understood as twins have birdness and birds have twinness, the Nuers' view, however unwarranted, suddenly gains a poetic aura. Instead of offensive or irrationality, we give it another type of quality, which we call poetic. In other words, in so-called primitive thought, between inverted commas, there is no heredity, there's no many-level inclusion, only endogenous links. This emphasizes that poetry is the favorite domain of endogenous connections. One can imagine poets and literature in many languages struggling against the tyranny of hierarchies and their role in the routinization of thought. in attempts to impose less constraint and more aesthetic alternatives. Reverie, attempts to impose less constraint and more aesthetic alternatives out of daydreaming. Reverie, whether in thought process or associated self-rewarding action, is the normal truth functioning of these operators that I can describe as being endogenous and can be described in terms of moving focus operations, whereof the participant in the football game is an apt illustration. When you look at the football field, you're not just staring at the contour. You're looking at where the action is, at the focus there in the center, which is the balloon and the people running around it. That's the way we need to think about language too. And the early connections, both in classic Chinese Eastern thinking and our own, were both focused rather on these categories, these labels we could put on things which would have a substrate, which would be impenetrable. That was the emphasis. Then we invented these hierarchies, which make it possible now to go through our memory network through two ways: the ways that the endogenous link propose, and the way that the hierarchies propose with the properties trickling down. Okay, that was the matter for lesson 14. Hope to see you soon for another lecture, hopefully for number 15. I'll see you soon. Thank you for your attention.